The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Princess Anne walked briskly through the corridors. Her boots clicked against the stone with the same determined rhythm that had carried her through decades of royal duties. Today felt different, though she couldn't quite place why. There was tension in the air, thick as London fog, and even the usually chattering staff seemed to move with hushed urgency, and had received an urgent message from her brother Charles the night before. The note, written in his familiar, careful handwriting, had been brief but concerning. He needed to see her privately about matters of great importance to the family. The Princess Royal had seen enough family crises to recognize when something serious was brewing beneath the surface of their carefully maintained public image. As she approached the private wing where Charles maintained his study, and noticed something unusual. The normally open hallways seemed different somehow. Security personnel were positioned at intervals she hadn't seen before, and their eyes held a watchfulness that went beyond routine protocol. She nodded to them as she passed, her mind already working through possibilities of what could require such precautions. The ornate double doors to Charles's private chamber came into view, and felt a flutter of unease in her stomach. She had been in this room countless times throughout their lives, during family celebrations, heated arguments, quiet conversations about their roles and responsibilities. Today, however, the familiar space seemed to hold secrets that made her footsteps slow involuntarily. As she reached for the heavy brass handle, a figure emerged from the shadows near a side corridor. Queen Camilla appeared with her characteristic grace, but there was something in her expression that immediately put Anne on alert. The queen consort's usual warm smile seemed forced, and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, a gesture Anne recognized as a sign of nervous energy. "And dear," Camilla said, her voice carrying a sweetness that somehow felt calculated. "How lovely to see you this morning. You look wonderful as always." Princess Anne paused, her hand still reaching toward the door handle. "Thank you, Camilla. Charles asked me to meet him here. Is he ready for our appointment?" Something flickered across Camilla's face, so quickly that Anne almost missed it. "Oh, I'm afraid there's been a slight change of plans. Charles has been called away on urgent state business. He asked me to convey his apologies and to reschedule for later in the week." Anne's eyebrows drew together in confusion. She had spoken with Charles's private secretary just that morning to confirm their meeting. There had been no mention of any scheduling conflicts or urgent matters that would pull him away. Her brother was notorious for his punctuality and rarely canceled personal appointments, especially ones he had specifically requested. "That's strange," Anne said slowly, studying Camilla's face. "He seemed quite insistent yesterday that we meet today. Are you certain he's not available?" Camilla's smile became even more strained, and she moved slightly to position herself more directly in front of the door. The movement was subtle, but Anne's years of dealing with diplomatic situations had taught her to notice such things. Something was definitely wrong with this picture. "Quite certain, I'm afraid," Camilla replied, her voice maintaining its pleasant tone despite the obvious tension. "You know how these things are. The demands of the crown never wait for convenient timing. I'm sure you understand better than anyone." And felt a growing irritation building in her chest. She had rearranged her own schedule, canceling a visit to a children's hospital that she had been looking forward to, in order to make time for this meeting. More than that, though, something about Camilla's demeanor was setting off alarm bells in her head. Where exactly was he called to? And asked, crossing her arms. Perhaps I could join him there, or we could speak by phone. The question seemed to catch Camilla off guard. For a moment, her carefully composed expression faltered, and saw something that looked almost like panic flash through her eyes. Well, it's a private matter. Security concerns, you understand. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details." Now, and was certain something was amiss. In all their years of family interactions, Camilla had never been evasive about Charles's whereabouts, especially not with his own sister. The queen consort was many things, but secretive about routine royal business was not typically one of them. "Camilla," Anne said, her voice taking on the firm tone she used when dealing with difficult situations. "I think there may be some confusion here. Charles specifically asked me to come at this time. I find it hard to believe he would simply disappear without a word." The two women stood facing each other in the ornate hallway, the tension between them growing thicker with each passing moment, and could see beads of perspiration forming on Camilla's forehead despite the cool temperature maintained throughout the palace. Whatever was happening here, the queen consort was clearly not comfortable with her role in it. "Perhaps," Camilla said, attempting to regain her composure, "we should walk together to the morning room. I could have tea brought, and we could discuss what might be better for you and Charles to meet. I'm sure we can work something out that suits everyone's schedule." The suggestion felt like a deflection, and Anne's instincts told her that accepting it would mean losing whatever opportunity she had to understand what was really happening. She looked past Camilla toward the chamber door, noting how the queen consort had positioned herself to block any easy approach. "I think I'll wait here for a few minutes," and said firmly, "just in case Charles returns sooner than expected. You never know with these urgent matters. They sometimes resolve more quickly than anticipated." Camilla's face went pale, and for the first time since their conversation began, her mask of polite civility slipped completely. "And really, I must insist that we move this conversation elsewhere. This area it's not appropriate for visitors at the moment." "Visitors?" and repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Camilla, I'm his sister, not a visitor. I've been in this palace since I was born. There's nowhere here that's inappropriate for me to be." The queen consort looked genuinely distressed now, wringing her hands and glancing nervously between and the door behind her. "It's just that there are sensitive discussions taking place, matters that require complete privacy. I'm sure you understand the need for discretion in our position," and felt her patience wearing thin. She had always tried to maintain a cordial relationship with Camilla, recognizing the difficult position the woman had found herself in when she married into the royal family. But this conversation was becoming increasingly frustrating, and she was beginning to suspect that something more significant than a simple scheduling conflict was at play. What kind of sensitive discussions? And pressed. If they involve family matters, then surely I should be included. We've always handled these things together as a family. Camilla's eyes darted toward the door again and caught the gesture. In that moment, she realized that her brother was likely inside the chamber, despite Camilla's claims to the contrary. The queen consort wasn't trying to reschedule a meeting. She was actively preventing him from entering a room where Charles was present. "Camilla," and said, her voice taking on a dangerous edge, "are you telling me that my brother's in that room right now, and you're preventing me from seeing him?" The accusation hung in the air between them like a sword. Camilla's face cycled through several expressions: surprise, guilt, defiance, and, finally, a kind of resigned determination. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less firm. "And there are things happening that are complicated. Charles is handling some very delicate matters, and he specifically asked not to be disturbed. I know this is frustrating for you, but I'm only following his wishes." The claim that Charles himself had asked not to see her felt like a physical blow, and had always prided herself on having a strong relationship with her brother, built on mutual respect and honest communication. The idea that he would exclude her from important family matters without explanation was both hurtful and confusing. "If that's true," and said slowly, "then I want to hear it from him directly. I'm not accepting secondhand information about my own brother's wishes, especially when those wishes seem completely out of character for him." She moved forward, intending to step around Camilla and approach the door directly. The queen consort, however, moved to block her path more obviously, no longer trying to disguise her intentions. "And please," Camilla said, her voice taking on a pleading quality, "you have to trust me on this. There are aspects to this situation that you don't understand. Charles is trying to protect everyone, including you. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions about who can be involved in certain conversations. Protect me," and laughed, "but There was no humor in the sound. "Camilla, I've been dealing with family crises and royal responsibilities since before you knew what Buckingham Palace looked like from the inside. I don't need protection from difficult conversations." The words came out harsher than and had intended, but her frustration was reaching a boiling point. She could feel years of carefully maintained politeness beginning to crack under the strain of this bizarre confrontation. Camilla's face flushed at the comment, and, for a moment, and thought she might abandon her post at the door. Instead, however, the queen consort seemed to draw strength from somewhere deep inside herself, straightening her shoulders and meeting Anne's gaze directly. "I understand your frustration," Camilla said, her voice steadier now. "And I know you think I have no right to stand between you and your brother. But I also know that Charles trusts me to handle difficult situations, and this is one of those times. He asked me to ensure that this particular meeting remained private, and that's what I'm going to do." And stared at the woman blocking her path, feeling a mixture of anger, confusion, and something that might have been grudging respect. Whatever else could be said about Camilla, she was clearly prepared to stand her ground, even when faced with the formidable displeasure of the Princess Royal. "And what if I choose not to accept your authority in this matter?" And asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "What if I decide to walk past you and enter that room regardless of your objections?" Camilla's face went white, but she didn't step aside. "Then, I suppose we'll have a very unpleasant scene that will serve no one's interests. And please, I'm asking you to trust that this is for the best. Charles will explain everything when the time is right." The mention of trust hit and like a slap. Trust had always been fundamental to the relationships within their family, even during the most difficult periods. The idea that she was being asked to trust Camilla's judgment over her own assessment of the situation felt like a betrayal of everything she thought she understood about her place in the family hierarchy. "Trust," and repeated slowly. "You're asking me to trust that you know better than I do what's best for my relationship with my own brother. You're asking me to accept that you have more authority over family matters than I do. Is that really what you're saying?" Camilla's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began to form in her eyes, and her voice shook when she responded. "I'm not asking for authority over anything, Anne. I'm begging you to understand that sometimes we have to make choices that hurt people we care about in order to prevent even greater hurt later on. Charles is facing something that could affect all of us, and he's trying to handle it in the way he thinks is best." The raw emotion in Camilla's voice gave and paused. Whatever was happening behind that door, it was clearly weighing heavily on both Charles and his wife. The realization didn't make Anne any less determined to understand what was going on, but it did make her reconsider her approach. "Camilla," Anne said, her voice softer but still firm, "if this is really about protecting the family, then excluding family members from important decisions isn't the way to do it. We've weathered storms before by standing together, not by keeping secrets from each other." Before Camilla could respond, they both heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the opposite end of the corridor, and turned to see one of Charles's private secretaries walking toward them with a folder tucked under his arm. The man's expression was serious, and he seemed surprised to find them standing in front of the chamber door. "Your Royal Highness," he said, nodding to and before turning to Camilla. "Your Majesty, His Majesty is ready for the next phase of the discussion. Shall I inform the others that they may proceed?" The secretary's words confirmed what Anne had already suspected. There was indeed a meeting taking place inside the chamber, and it involved multiple people. The fact that she had been deliberately excluded from something that appeared to involve others only strengthened her resolve to understand what was happening. "Thank you," Camilla replied to the secretary, her voice carefully controlled. "Please inform His Majesty that will be just another moment." The secretary nodded and retreated, but not before glancing curiously at Anne's presence in the corridor. Once he was out of earshot, and turned back to Camilla with renewed determination. "Now I know for certain that you've been lying to me," Anne said, her voice cold with anger. "Charles isn't away on urgent business. He's in that room right now, with multiple other people, discussing something that apparently affects the entire family. And for reasons I can't begin to understand, you've been instructed to keep me out of those discussions." Camilla's shoulders sagged as if the weight of the deception had finally become too much to bear. "And you have to understand, no," and interrupted, holding up her hand. "I don't have to understand anything except that my own family is keeping secrets from me. That's unacceptable, and I won't stand for it." She moved toward the door again, this time with clear intent to push past Camilla regardless of the consequences. The queen consort, however, stepped firmly into her path once more, her face set with grim determination. "I can't let you go in there," Camilla said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am sorry, Anne. I truly am. But I gave Charles my word, and I intend to keep it." The two women stood facing each other in the ornate hallway, neither willing to back down. The morning sun continued to stream through the tall windows, casting strange shadows that seemed to emphasize the surreal nature of their confrontation. In all her years as a member of the royal family, and had never found herself in such a bizarre and frustrating situation. As the standoff continued, and realized that this moment would likely change her relationship with both Charles and Camilla forever. Whatever was happening behind that door, the fact that she was being actively excluded from it suggested that the family dynamics she had always taken for granted were shifting in ways she didn't yet understand. The thought filled her with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the palace's marble floors and everything to do with the growing certainty that her world was about to change in ways she couldn't control or predict. Inside the chamber, Charles sat at the head of an oval mahogany table that had witnessed countless royal decisions throughout the centuries. The room itself seemed heavy with the weight of history and the gravity of the current situation. Sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, casting everything in a golden hue that somehow made the proceedings feel even more solemn. Around the table sat several key figures whose presence indicated the serious nature of whatever was being discussed. The Archbishop of Canterbury occupied the chair to Charles's right, his weathered face reflecting years of providing spiritual guidance during the monarchy's most challenging moments. Across from him sat the private secretary to the sovereign, a man whose discretion and loyalty had been tested through multiple royal crises. Two other senior advisors completed the circle, their faces grave with the responsibility of whatever decisions were being made. Charles himself appeared older than his years in this moment. The crown had always been a burden as much as an honor, but today that burden seemed to press down on his shoulders with particular weight. His fingers drummed nervously against the polished wood of the table, and his usual composed demeanor showed cracks that revealed the human being beneath the royal facade. "The situation with the Duke of York has reached a critical juncture," Charles was saying, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotion underlying his words. "The new evidence that has come to light leaves us with very limited options for moving forward." The private secretary nodded gravely. "The legal team has reviewed everything thoroughly, Your Majesty. While there are no criminal charges pending at this time, the civil implications are substantial. More importantly, the potential damage to the monarchy's reputation could be irreversible if this information becomes public in an uncontrolled manner." Charles felt the familiar weight of family loyalty pulling against his duty to the crown. Andrew had always been their mother's favorite, and the pain of what needed to be done felt like a physical ache in his chest. But the advisors were right. The institution he had inherited was bigger than any one person, even his own brother. "What are our realistic options?" Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Complete separation," the Archbishop said quietly. "All royal duties suspended indefinitely. Full removal from public roles and ceremonies. It's the only way to create enough distance to protect the monarchy while this situation continues to develop." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Charles knew that what they were discussing would effectively end Andrew's role in the family business forever. There would be no coming back from this level of disgrace, no path to redemption that would allow his brother to resume his royal duties. "And the timing?" Charles asked, dreading the answer. Immediately, the private secretary replied, "Every day we delay increases the risk of the information leaking before we can control the narrative. The press is already sniffing around, and our intelligence suggests they're closer to the full story than we'd like." Charles closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. When he opened them again, his expression was that of a king rather than a brother. "Then we proceed. Draft the necessary documents. I'll handle the conversation with Andrew personally." As the advisors began discussing the technical aspects of stripping Andrew of his remaining royal roles, Charles found his thoughts drifting to Anne. His sister's sharp mind and unwavering loyalty had been sources of strength throughout his life. In normal circumstances, she would be sitting at this very table, offering her insights and helping shoulder the burden of impossible decisions. But these weren't normal circumstances. The information they had received about Andrew was so damaging, so potentially explosive, that Charles had made the difficult decision to limit knowledge of it to only the most essential people. Anne's fierce protectiveness of family members could make her a liability in a situation that required cold, calculated decision-making. "Your Majesty," the private secretary said, interrupting Charles's thoughts, "there's one more matter we need to address. The Princess Royal has been asking questions about today's meeting. The Queen Consort is managing the situation, but Princess and is persistent." Charles felt a stab of guilt at the mention of his sister. He knew and well enough to understand that being excluded from important family decisions would be deeply hurtful to her. Their relationship had always been built on mutual respect and inclusion, and he was violating that trust by keeping her in the dark. "How much does she know?" Charles asked. "Very little, sir. Only that you requested a meeting and then appeared to be unavailable. Queen Camilla has been creative in her explanations, but the Princess Royal is clearly suspicious." The idea of Camilla having to lie to and on his behalf made Charles feel even worse. His wife had reluctantly agreed to help manage the situation, but he knew she was uncomfortable with the deception. The tension between his duty as king and his obligations as a husband and brother was tearing him apart. Perhaps, the Archbishop suggested gently, it would be wise to bring Princess Anne into the discussion. Her discretion is beyond question, and her counsel has always been valuable during family crises. Charles considered the suggestion seriously. Anne's judgment was indeed excellent, and her ability to separate emotion from necessity when making difficult decisions was well established. But the information about Andrew was so sensitive, so potentially devastating, that every additional person who knew about it represented another risk of exposure. "The decision has been made," Charles said finally. "We keep the circle as small as possible until after we've handled the immediate crisis, and we'll understand once she knows the full situation." Even as he said the words, Charles wasn't entirely convinced they were true. Anne's sense of family loyalty ran as deep as his own, and being excluded from decisions about their brother would feel like a betrayal regardless of the circumstances that necessitated it. The private secretary cleared his throat. "Sir, there's also the matter of the other family members. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Princess Eugenie, and Princess Beatrice. They'll all need to be informed at some point, and their reactions will need to be managed carefully." Charles nodded, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of managing not just the immediate crisis, but also its ripple effects throughout the entire family structure. Each person would react differently, and each reaction would need to be anticipated and prepared for. "One thing at a time," he said, attempting to maintain focus on the most pressing issues. "First, we handle Andrew. Then, we manage the family communications. The press strategy comes after that." As the discussion continued, Charles found himself thinking about the irony of his position. He had spent his entire life preparing to be king, understanding that the role would require him to make difficult decisions that prioritize the institution over personal relationships. But he had never fully grasped how isolating those decisions would be or how much it would hurt to exclude the very people whose support he needed most. Outside the chamber door, he knew and was probably growing more frustrated by the minute. His sister's temperament didn't lend itself to patient waiting, especially when she suspected she was being deliberately misled. The longer this meeting continued, the more difficult the eventual conversation with her would become. "Your Majesty," one of the advisors said, consulting his notes, "we should also discuss the financial implications. The Duke of York's allowance will need to be addressed, and there may be legal costs associated with managing the situation." Charles waved his hand dismissively. "Money is the least of our concerns right now. Whatever it costs to handle this properly and protect the monarchy is what we'll spend." The cavalier attitude toward expenses was unlike Charles, who typically paid close attention to royal finances. But the gravity of the Andrew situation had shifted his priorities dramatically. The potential damage to the crown's reputation was incalculable, making any financial costs seem insignificant by comparison. "There's one more thing, sir," the private secretary said hesitantly. "The Duke of York has requested a private meeting with you before any public announcements are made. He's quite distressed about the developments." Charles felt his heart sink even further. The conversation with Andrew would be one of the most difficult of his life. Telling his own brother that his royal career was effectively over would require every ounce of strength and composure Charles possessed. "Schedule it for this afternoon," Charles said quietly. "After we've finalized all the documentation. I want everything ready before I speak with him." The meeting continued for another hour, with various details being discussed and refined. Legal strategies were reviewed, press statements were drafted, and contingency plans were developed for different scenarios. Through it all, Charles felt the weight of kingship pressing down on him more heavily than ever before. When the session finally concluded, Charles remained seated as the others filed out of the room. The archbishop lingered for a moment, placing a gentle hand on the king's shoulder. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "you're making the right decision. The institution must survive, even when the personal cost is high." Charles nodded, but the words provided little comfort. The institution would indeed survive, but the relationships that had sustained him throughout his life were being damaged in ways that might prove irreparable. The loneliness of leadership had never felt more acute. As the last advisor left the chamber, Charles sat alone in the golden silence, trying to gather the strength for what lay ahead. He would need to face Andrew, explain to and why she had been excluded, and somehow maintain the facade of royal unity while the family was being torn apart from within. The sound of raised voices from the corridor outside caught his attention. Even through the heavy door, he could make out Anne's distinctive tone, sharp with frustration and determination. Camilla's softer voice was responding, but Charles couldn't make out her words. He rose from his chair and moved toward the door, his hand hovering over the handle. Every instinct told him to open it, to invite and in and share the burden of this impossible situation with someone who understood the family dynamics as well as he did. But his duty as king demanded otherwise. Charles stepped back from the door, returning to his seat at the table. The voices outside continued for several more minutes before gradually fading as the conversation moved elsewhere in the palace. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, weighted with all the words that hadn't been spoken and all the relationships that were being strained beyond their breaking point. The morning sun was climbing higher in the sky, and Charles knew that the day ahead would bring even more difficult conversations and painful decisions. The confrontation with Andrew loomed largest in his mind, but the eventual explanation too, and worried him almost as much. As he sat alone in the chamber where so many royal decisions had been made throughout history, Charles understood that this day would be remembered as a turning point. The monarchy would survive, as it always had, but the family relationships that had sustained it would never be quite the same. The burden of the crown had never felt heavier, and the isolation of leadership had never been more complete. Outside the chamber, life in the palace continued as always, but inside, a king grappled with the terrible loneliness of making decisions that would protect the institution while destroying the people he loved most. 3 hours had passed since Anne's confrontation with Camilla in the corridor, and the Princess Royal found herself pacing restlessly in her private sitting room. The conversation had ended abruptly when Camilla had finally agreed to arrange an alternative meeting time, but Anne's instincts told her that something far more significant was happening than a simple scheduling conflict. She had tried to focus on other matters throughout the morning, reviewing correspondence from various charitable organizations and preparing for upcoming engagements. But her mind kept returning to the strange encounter outside Charles's chamber and the look of genuine distress she had seen in Camilla's eyes. Whatever was being discussed behind those closed doors, it was clearly taking an emotional toll on everyone involved. Anne's personal assistant had discreetly made some inquiries among the palace staff, but the responses had been frustratingly vague. Multiple senior advisors had been seen entering and leaving the private wing throughout the morning, suggesting meetings of considerable importance. Security had been heightened in certain areas, and several staff members had been instructed to clear their schedules for the remainder of the day. The pieces of information painted a picture of crisis management, but Anne couldn't determine what kind of crisis required such elaborate secrecy. Her years of experience with royal protocols told her that the situation was serious enough to warrant the highest levels of discretion, which only made her exclusion more puzzling and hurtful. A soft knock on her door interrupted her brooding. "Come in," she called, expecting to see her assistant with updates on her afternoon schedule. Instead, Camilla entered the room, looking considerably more composed than she had that morning, but still showing signs of strain around her eyes. She had changed into a different outfit and noticed that her hands were no longer trembling as they had been during their corridor confrontation. "And," Camilla said quietly, closing the door behind her, "I wondered if we might have a proper conversation. I know this morning was difficult for both of us," and gestured toward one of the comfortable chairs arranged near the window. "Please sit down. I think we do need to talk." Camilla settled herself carefully and noticed how she chose her words before speaking. "I want you to know that keeping you out of that meeting was not my decision. Charles specifically asked me to ensure that the discussions remain private, and I was simply following his instructions. That's what troubles me most," Anne replied, settling into the chair opposite her sister-in-law. "Charles and I have never kept important family matters from each other. The fact that he asked you to exclude me suggests that something very serious is happening." Camilla's composure wavered slightly. "It is serious, and more serious than you might imagine. Charles is trying to protect everyone, including you, by limiting who has access to certain information." "Protect me from what?" Anne asked, leaning forward. "Camilla, I've been dealing with family crises and royal scandals my entire life. There's very little that could shock me at this point, and nothing that would make me unable to handle whatever situation we're facing." The Queen Consort was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how much she could or should reveal. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It concerns Andrew," and felt her stomach clench with dread. Her younger brother had been a source of worry for the family for years, and she had long feared that his poor judgment would eventually create problems that couldn't be managed quietly. "What's happened now?" "I can't give you details," Camilla said, her eyes showing genuine regret. "Charles made me promise not to discuss specifics with anyone outside the core group that's handling the situation. And it's bad. Worse than anything we've dealt with before." The confirmation that her instincts had been correct provided no satisfaction, and felt a cold fear settling in her chest as she contemplated what could be serious enough to warrant such extreme secrecy. Andrew's past indiscretions had already caused significant embarrassment for the family, but the level of crisis management being employed suggested something far more damaging. "Is he in legal trouble?" Anne asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Camilla's silence was more telling than any words could have been. The Queen Consort's inability to deny legal implications confirmed Anne's worst fears about the nature of the crisis. "How long have you known?" and asked the full extent of it. Since yesterday evening, Charles received some information that changed everything. That's when he decided to convene this morning's meeting with the senior advisors and absorb this timeline, realizing that Charles had received devastating news about Andrew and then immediately excluded her from the family's response to it. The professional slight was hurtful, but the personal betrayal cut much deeper. And Charles decided that I couldn't be trusted with this information. It's not about trust, Camilla said quickly. Charles trusts you completely. But he also knows how protective you are of Andrew, and he was concerned that your judgment might be compromised by your feelings for your brother. The suggestion that her emotions would interfere with her ability to make sound decisions struck and as deeply insulting. My feelings for Andrew have never prevented me from recognizing when his behavior was problematic. I've been one of his harshest critics when the situation warranted it. I know that, Camilla said, and I told Charles as much. But this situation it's different from anything we've faced before. The decisions that need to be made are going to hurt Andrew badly, and Charles was trying to spare you from having to be part of that process, and felt a flash of anger at the condescending nature of Charles's protection. That wasn't his decision to make. Whatever consequences Andrew is facing, he brought them on himself through his own choices. I don't need to be shielded from the reality of that situation. Camilla looked genuinely sympathetic. I understand why you're upset, and I think you're right to be. Charles is trying to handle an impossible situation, and he's making decisions based on what he thinks is best for everyone. But that doesn't mean his decisions are correct or fair to you. The admission surprised Anne. She had expected Camilla to defend Charles's choices completely, not to acknowledge that the king might have made an error in judgment. What exactly has been decided about Andrew? And asked. Complete separation from royal duties. Permanently. All patronages removed. All ceremonial roles ended. No future public appearances in any official capacity. The severity of the punishment confirmed Anne's fears about the seriousness of whatever Andrew had done. Such drastic measures wouldn't be taken unless the situation posed an existential threat to the monarchy itself. When will this be announced? And asked. Within the next few days. Charles wanted everything legally documented and the public relations strategy finalized before making any announcements, and felt a profound sadness settling over her as she contemplated the end of Andrew's royal career. Whatever mistakes her brother had made, watching his complete banishment from the family business would be painful for everyone involved. Has anyone told Andrew yet? Charles was planning to speak with him this afternoon. I imagine that conversation is happening right now. The thought of Charles having to deliver such devastating news to their brother without any family support made Anne's heart ache. Despite her anger at being excluded, she felt sorry for the impossible position Charles had been placed in. This is going to destroy Andrew, and said quietly. Yes, Camilla agreed, her voice heavy with sadness. It probably will, but Charles believes it's the only way to protect the monarchy. The alternative is watching the entire institution potentially collapse under the weight of the scandal, and understood the logic, even if she disagreed with the process that had led to it. The monarchy was bigger than any individual, even family members, and sometimes protecting it required making brutal choices about people you loved. What about the rest of the family? Beatrice and Eugenie? They'll be told after Charles speaks with Andrew. William and Catherine are being briefed tomorrow. The goal is to ensure everyone understands the situation and the reasoning before any public announcements are made. And noticed that she wasn't mentioned in the list of family members being briefed, confirming her suspicion that Charles intended to keep her excluded from the entire process. And me? She asked. When was Charles planning to inform me of decisions that affect our entire family? Camilla looked genuinely uncomfortable with the question. I don't think he had worked out those details yet. Everything has been moving very quickly, and he's been focused on the immediate crisis management. The non-answer felt like another insult, and realized that Charles had been so focused on managing the situation that he hadn't even considered how or when to include his own sister in the family's response to it. Camilla, and said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "I need you to understand something. Charles may be the king, but he's still my brother, and Andrew is still my brother too. Excluding me from family decisions isn't just professionally problematic, it's personally devastating." "I understand," Camilla said, and could see that she genuinely meant it. "I've tried to explain that to Charles, but he's been operating in crisis mode since yesterday evening. His judgment about family dynamics isn't as clear as it usually is." The acknowledgement that Charles's decision-making had been impaired by stress gave and some hope that the situation could still be salvaged. "What would you suggest I do?" "Wait until he's finished with Andrew this afternoon," Camilla said. "Then request a private meeting and explain how his decisions have affected you. Charles loves you, and he trusts your judgment. I think once the immediate crisis passes, he'll realize that excluding you was a mistake," and appreciated the advice, but she wasn't sure she could wait patiently while her family made irreversible decisions without her input. The protective instincts that Charles was trying to shield her from were exactly what made her valuable during family crises. "What if I disagree with the decisions that have already been made?" and asked. "Then you tell Charles that," Camilla replied. "It may be too late to change course completely, but your perspective could still influence how the situation is handled moving forward." The conversation was interrupted by a discreet knock on the door. Anne's assistant entered with a message that had just arrived from the king's private secretary, and read it quickly, her expression darkening with each line. "What is it?" Camilla asked. "Charles wants to see me tomorrow morning to discuss recent developments," and said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Tomorrow morning, after he's handled everything else and made all the important decisions without me." Camilla winced at the dismissive tone of the appointment. "And I think he's trying to manage me," and interrupted. "Just like he managed you this morning, and just like he's probably managing everyone else. Charles has decided that he knows what's best for all of us, and he's treating us accordingly." The hurt in Anne's voice was palpable, and Camilla felt a deep sadness for the damage that was being done to relationships that had sustained the family through previous crises. Charles's efforts to protect everyone were inadvertently causing the very divisions he was trying to prevent. "What are you going to do?" Camilla asked, and looked out the window at the palace gardens, where tourists were taking photographs and children were feeding the birds. The normal world continued beyond the walls of the palace, unaware that inside, a family was being torn apart by secrets and good intentions. "I'm going to wait until tomorrow morning," and said finally. "And then I'm going to tell my brother exactly what I think of his decision to exclude me from the most important family crisis in decades." The determination in her voice made it clear that the conversation between Anne and Charles would be unlike any they had ever had. The foundation of trust and mutual respect that had sustained their relationship for decades had been cracked, and repairing it would require more than royal protocol and carefully worded explanations. As Camilla left the room and remained by the window, contemplating how quickly everything had changed. This morning she had been a trusted family member and senior royal. Tonight she was an outsider, excluded from decisions about her own brother's future and treated like someone whose emotions might compromise important royal business. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and ominous at the same time. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would either repair her relationship with Charles or damage it beyond recognition. Whatever Andrew had done, the ripple effects were already destroying the family relationships that had always been their greatest source of strength. The following morning arrived gray and somber, matching the mood that had settled over the palace like a heavy blanket. And had slept poorly, her mind cycling through possible conversations and their potential outcomes. She had dressed with particular care, choosing a navy suit that projected both authority and dignity. If this was to be a confrontation, she would meet it on equal terms. Charles waited for her in a different room this time, his private study rather than the formal chamber where yesterday's crisis meeting had taken place. The choice of venue felt significant too, and it suggested a more personal conversation rather than an official royal briefing. But the careful positioning of chairs and the presence of tea service indicated that Charles had prepared for this meeting as thoroughly as any state function. When it entered, Charles rose from his chair with an expression that mixed relief, apprehension, and something that might have been shame. The events of the past day had clearly taken a toll on him. He looked older somehow, as if the weight of kingship had settled more heavily on his shoulders overnight. And he said, his voice warmer than she had expected, "Thank you for coming. I know yesterday was complicated," and repeated, taking the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. "That's an interesting choice of words, Charles. I would have called it deliberately exclusionary and deeply hurtful." The directness of her response made Charles wince, but he didn't deflect or try to minimize her concerns. "You're absolutely right to be angry with me. I handled yesterday poorly, and I owe you an explanation and an apology." The ready acknowledgement of fault surprised Anne. She had prepared for defensiveness and justification, not immediate contrition. "I'm listening," she said, though her tone remained cool. Charles poured tea for both of them, his hands steadier than they had been during yesterday's crisis meetings. Andrew is facing serious legal exposure related to his business dealings and personal conduct. The evidence that came to light this week is damaging enough that our legal advisors believe complete separation from royal duties is the only way to protect the monarchy, and had expected bad news. But the careful way Charles phrased his explanation suggested that the reality was even worse than she had imagined. How serious is serious legal exposure? Potentially criminal charges, financial impropriety, personal conduct that could result in significant civil liability. Charles paused, clearly struggling with how much detail to provide. And it's worse than anything we've dealt with before, including his previous difficulties. The confirmation of her worst fears hit, and like a physical blow. She had known Andrew was reckless and prone to poor judgment, but criminal exposure suggested a level of misconduct that went far beyond anything she had imagined. "How long have you known?" she asked. The full scope became clear Monday evening. I received a briefing from our legal team that changed everything. That's when I decided to convene yesterday's emergency meeting and process this timeline, understanding now why Charles had moved so quickly to exclude her from the crisis management. "And you decided immediately that I couldn't be trusted with this information?" Charles set down his teacup and looked directly at his sister. "I decided that I couldn't bear to watch you go through the pain of making the decisions we had to make. And what we discussed yesterday will effectively end Andrew's life as he knows it. I was trying to spare you from having to participate in that process." The explanation revealed a paternalistic attitude that and found deeply offensive. "Charles, I'm not a child who needs protection from difficult realities. I'm a senior member of this family and an experienced royal. Your attempt to spare my feelings has actually caused me more pain than including me would have." "I realize that now," Charles said quietly. "Camilla helped me understand how wrong my approach was. But at the time, I was operating on instinct rather than clear thinking. The information about Andrew was so devastating that I wasn't making rational decisions about anything else," and felt some of her anger begin to shift toward understanding. The burden of making decisions that would destroy his own brother's life would have been crushing for Charles, and his judgment about secondary issues would naturally have been impaired. "What exactly has been decided about Andrew's future?" she asked. "Complete removal from all royal duties, effective immediately. All patronages terminated, all honorary positions revoked. No future participation in any royal functions or ceremonies. Financially, his allowance will be suspended, though we'll ensure he has basic support for legal representation." The comprehensive nature of Andrew's banishment was shocking even though and had expected something severe. Has he been told? Yesterday afternoon. It was the most difficult conversation of my life. Charles's composure wavered as he spoke about confronting their brother. Andrew is devastated, doesn't begin to cover it. He's lost everything that gave his life meaning and structure, and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Sympathy for Andrew's suffering, anger at the choices that had led to this moment, and sadness for the family relationships that were being destroyed. How'd he take the news? Badly. He became quite emotional, pleading for alternatives and claiming that the evidence could be discredited. He couldn't accept that the situation had moved beyond damage control into crisis management. The image of Andrew begging for mercy from their older brother was heartbreaking. Whatever his faults, he was still the little boy who had looked up to both of them throughout their childhood. "Did you tell him that I didn't know about any of this?" and asked. Charles looked ashamed. "No, I allowed him to believe that the entire family was united in this decision. I thought it would make the conversation easier for him if he didn't feel like he was being abandoned by everyone." The revelation that Andrew believed she had participated in the decision to banish him felt like another betrayal. "Charles, he thinks I helped destroy his life. How could you let him believe that?" "Because I was thinking about protecting him, not about protecting your relationship with him," Charles admitted. "I made the same mistake with you that I made with the entire situation. I focused on immediate crisis management without considering the long-term consequences for our family relationships, and felt the full weight of how badly Charles had mishandled every aspect of this crisis. His attempts to protect everyone had actually damaged the very relationships that might have provided support during this difficult time." "What happens now?" she asked. "The public announcement will be made tomorrow. A carefully worded statement about Andrew stepping back from royal duties due to personal matters. The press will speculate, but we're hoping to control the narrative enough to minimize damage to the monarchy," and knew that controlling the narrative would be nearly impossible once the media began investigating Andrew's situation seriously. "And the legal issues? Andrew will need to handle those privately, with his own legal representation. The Crown cannot be seen as providing any support that might be interpreted as influencing the legal process." The cold practicality of distancing the monarchy from Andrew's legal troubles highlighted how completely he was being abandoned by the institution he had served his entire life. "Charles," and said slowly, "I understand the necessity of protecting the Crown. I've always understood that the institution is bigger than any individual. But the way you've handled this has been catastrophically bad for our family." "I know," Charles replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to be a good king, but I've been a terrible brother. To both Andrew and to you." The admission of failure was unlike Charles, who typically maintained royal composure even during the most difficult conversations. His vulnerability was almost harder to watch than his earlier defensiveness would have been. "The relationship between Andrew and me may never recover from this," and continued. "He believes I betrayed him, and you allowed that belief to continue for your own convenience. That's unforgivable." Charles nodded, accepting the criticism without argument. "Is there anything I can do to help repair that damage?" "You can tell him the truth. Immediately. He needs to understand that I was excluded from these decisions, not complicit in them." "I'll call him this afternoon," Charles promised, "though I'm not sure it will help much at this point. The damage to his trust in all of us may be irreversible," and felt a deep sadness settling over her as she contemplated the long-term consequences of this crisis. Even if Andrew's legal troubles were resolved favorably, the family relationships that had sustained them through previous difficulties had been badly damaged. "There's something else we need to discuss," Charles said hesitantly. "The other family members, William and Catherine, Harry and Meghan, Beatrice and Eugenie. They all need to be briefed before the public announcement, and their reactions will need to be managed carefully. Let me handle Beatrice and Eugenie," and said immediately. "They're going to be devastated, and they'll need support from someone who wasn't involved in the decision-making process." Charles looked relieved. "That would be enormously helpful. I've been dreading those conversations." "What about the wider family? The Queen's other children, the cousins who participate in royal functions?" "Minimal briefings only. We're trying to limit detailed knowledge to immediate family members and essential staff," and understood the security reasoning, but She also recognized that the strategy would create divisions within the broader royal family that could persist long after the immediate crisis passed. "Charles, I need you to understand something," and said, her tone becoming more serious. "This crisis hasn't just damaged Andrew's relationship with the family. It's damaged trust between all of us. The way you handled this situation has shown everyone that you're willing to exclude family members from important decisions when you think it serves your purposes." The accusation hit Charles like a physical blow. "That wasn't my intention, but that's the result," and continued. "Everyone will now wonder whether they can trust you to include them in future family decisions, or whether you'll decide that protecting them from difficult information is more important than treating them as equal family members." Charles sat quietly for several minutes, absorbing the full scope of what his crisis management had cost the family. The monarchy might survive Andrew's disgrace, but the personal relationships that had sustained the royal family through previous difficulties had been badly weakened. "How do we move forward from this?" he asked finally. "Carefully," and replied. "With more communication, not less. With inclusion rather than protection. And with the understanding that trust, once broken, is much harder to rebuild than it was to maintain." As their conversation continued, both siblings understood that this crisis would mark a fundamental change in their family dynamics. The easy trust and mutual respect that had characterized their relationship was gone, replaced by something more fragile and conditional. Outside the study windows, London continued its daily rhythm, unaware that inside the palace, a family was grappling with the consequences of good intentions and bad decisions. The monarchy would survive, as it always had, but the personal cost had been higher than anyone had anticipated. When and finally left the study, both she and Charles understood that their relationship had been permanently altered. They would continue to work together and support each other, but the fundamental trust that had sustained them through decades of royal service had been damaged in ways that might never fully heal. The price of protecting the crown had been paid not just by Andrew, but by the entire family. Whether that price had been worth paying would be a question that haunted them all for years to come.